Hello there, you're watching India Global on NDTV. I'm Maha Siddiqui. Over the next half an hour, an overview of the big international stories of the week that matter to India. But first, the headlines. A telephone call between Prime Minister Modi and Russian President Vladimir Putin ahead of the virtual SCO summit next week and after Putin thwarts the biggest challenge yet in the Ukraine war. A challenge from within from mercenary group chief Yevgeny Prigozhin. Chinese President Xi Jinping and Pakistan Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif confirmed their attendance for the SCO summit to be held virtually, hosted by India on Tuesday. The US Supreme Court strikes down affirmative action in college admissions for diversity. Race will no longer be considered as a criteria for admission, ruling likely to impact job prospects as well for candidates of color. First up, the big story. Russian President Vladimir Putin and Prime Minister Modi had a telephone conversation ahead of the SCO summit next week and after President Putin averted a rebellion last week. As per Kremlin, the rebellion was discussed in the telephone call and Prime Minister Modi expressed understanding. The Kremlin statement also interestingly mentions that during the call, Prime Minister Modi, and these are the words of Kremlin, informed the Russian president of his foreign contacts, including the visit to Washington, D.C. The Indian side's press release, though, makes no mention of this. On the Ukraine issue, it says that Prime Minister Modi reiterated the call for dialogue and diplomacy. On the back of this threat that has been witnessed in Russia, the NSA had also in fact called the Indian counterpart Ajit Doval a few days ago. As per the Russian side, Nikolai Patrushev informed Doval of the latest events in Russia and discussed security cooperation as well. Now, after the attempted coup by mercenary group Wagner chief, and which was thwarted, all eyes are on what's in store for who was once a Putin aide, Yevgeny Prigozhin. All charges have been dropped against him and he's in Belarus. But the bigger question is Putin losing his grip over Russia?
Russian President Vladimir Putin may have thwarted the biggest challenge yet since the start of the Ukraine war. A challenge from his own former aide and Wagner Group chief Yevgeny Prigozhin, whose mercenary group fighters and armored vehicles reached within 400 kilometers of Moscow. Putin in his statement blames the West for this attempted coup. But was this indeed a threat to him?
When you look at what happened on Saturday, it doesn't completely compute. But I would say, yes, it was ostensibly the biggest threat to his rule since he took power at the end of 1999.
Belarus president talked to Wagner chief and a deal was struck. After which, the private military group retreated. Yevgeny Prigozhin fled to Belarus and Russia has dropped all charges against him.
Putin called me and informed me in detail about the situation that is happening in Russia. The most dangerous thing, as I understand it, was not the situation itself but how it could develop and its consequences. A cruel decision was made to eliminate Prigozhin. I suggested to Putin not to rush.
Под текстом выступления Путина мочить. Я предложил Путину не торопиться.
But the 24 hours which saw this episode unfold shocked the world and raised several questions. Questions such as, has Putin lost his hold on power? Is revolt simmering against Putin inside his government too? Is the Russian army not as strong as was once believed to be? How did around 50,000 militiamen reach so close to Moscow? Does the disintegration of the Wagner group help Ukraine in the war?
We solved this problem so quick, for 24 hours, I can tell you again. And I don't see any weakness from government, from president, because soldiers from Wagner, they are heroes, most of them, but Prigozhin is a traitor.
He, I think, miscalculated how that would be taken and effectively demonstrated just the scale of weakness of the Russian government and of Putin.
The coup, which wasn't, has gravely dented the strongman image of Putin, and the world is watching what his next step would be.
Meanwhile, next week, India will be hosting the SCO summit virtually. President Putin will be part of the summit. Chinese President Xi Jinping and Pakistan Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif have confirmed their attendance today itself. Meanwhile, let's take a look now at who this person exactly is, the one who announced this rebellion, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the man who challenged Putin from being a close aide of Putin to unleashing a rebellion against him. He has a checkered past. In 1981, he was sentenced to 9 years in prison on charges of assaulting and robbing a woman. In 1990, he sold hot dogs in Leningrad in Russia. Between 2000 and 2014, his company was tasked with cooking for Kremlin. And when Russia annexed Crimea, Prigozhin established the Wagner Group, fought key battles for Russia overseas. Prigozhin, in fact, even recruited prisoners to boost the strength. The fallout this time has happened because of his dissatisfaction or frustration with Moscow over insufficient ammunition, he said, to his mercenary fighters in Ukraine. Meanwhile, we are now turning our attention to the other big story that we are tracking, and that is as far as the US is concerned. In what is being seen as another setback to progressive steps incorporated in the society, the US Supreme Court has now struck down affirmative action after its ruling on abortion earlier. What does affirmative action mean? This means that universities and colleges in the US that were striving for diversity and placing value on race and color for admission intake, after this ruling by the Supreme Court, will no longer be doing so. This was meant to counter historical prejudices against certain identities. The US Supreme Court decision on Thursday has struck down affirmative action and made it unlawful now for colleges to take race into consideration as a specific factor in admissions. Chief Justice John Roberts, in the majority opinion, said that students must be treated based on their experiences as individuals, not on the basis of race. But dissenting Democratic appointed justices objected, insisting that the ruling would make it practically impossible for institutions to take race into account for admissions. Now, here are two sets of polar opposite reactions that came into the ruling, both from former presidents, President Trump and President Obama. Here's what Trump, a Republican, said, welcoming the move rather. It's saying that it's a great day for America. People with extraordinary abilities should be allowed to take on what they want to do in life. But here's Obama putting things into perspective as well. He says that affirmative action gave them a chance to show that they are more than deserving to a seat at the table. This is with regards to people of color. Let's listen in now to what the present president, President Biden, had to say, and the response from Harvard that was at the heart of this case.
I strongly disagree with the court's decision. Many people wrongly believe that affirmative action allows unqualified students to be admitted ahead of qualified students. This is not how college admissions work. We cannot let this decision be the last word, because the truth is, we all know it, discrimination still exists in America.
For nearly 9 years, Harvard vigorously defended our admissions process and our belief that we all benefit from learning, living, and working alongside people of different backgrounds and experiences. We will comply with the court's decision, but it does not change our values. We continue to believe deeply that a thriving, diverse intellectual community is essential to academic excellence and critical to shaping the next generation of leaders.
Let me now go across to U.S. academician Sindhu Manjesh, who's joining us here for helping us understand what are the ramifications of this ruling. Sindhu, many thanks for speaking with NDTV. First of all, will this have any sort of a spillover effect, Sindhu, as far as perhaps even jobs are concerned? Could we see that being impacted too for people of color?
Thank you for having me. Well, Maha, I think this Supreme Court ruling is without a doubt a setback for racial equity and diversity on college campuses. It actually makes the playing field a lot more uneven for people from historically disadvantaged backgrounds who don't have the privilege of having the kind of high school education which translates to great rankings and scores, which their white counterparts might perhaps have. So they're going to find it a lot more difficult to kind of enter university and college campuses. And if they do not have access to good higher education, obviously they're not going to stand a good chance in the job market. So it's like a kind of a domino effect that could occur. But at the same time, while it is on the surface and on the face of it clearly a setback for racial equity and diversity and the diverse ecosystem that universities have been trying to kind of foster on their campuses, it could have unintended consequences, because now universities are going to start getting more creative in how they kind of conduct their admissions process.
Right, Sindhu. Also, for the sake of our viewers, can you also help us understand how different was the US affirmative action vis-a-vis India's reservation system, or are they pretty much similar in nature?
While the concept and the idea and the ideal are the same, they are very, very different in the way they operate and play out on the ground. In the Indian reservation system, the quota system, we have certain percentages of quotas fixed and reserved for students. It is theirs. So like when you have a pool of say 100 applicants, 25 of them are reserved for students from underprivileged and discriminated backgrounds. There is no such reservation as such in the affirmative action. All it says is that campuses, universities and colleges can can make decisions based on if they have two equal candidates. If someone is discriminated against historically, they might get like a shout out and a shoe into the system. So there's no reservation as such, but it's an enabling act.
All right. Sindhu, many thanks for joining us with that quick look at how the affirmative action ruling can really impact the society at large, considering it is only for admissions, but it has a larger ramification there. Many thanks.
Thank you very much.
Let's now turn our attention back to the Prime Minister's US visit once again, and this time focus specifically on trade, as the two sides decided to settle 6 disputes outside the World Trade Organization. What does this reflect? Let's bring in the US ISPF's chief, Dr. Mukesh Aghi here. Many thanks, sir, for speaking with NDTV. Now, the two sides have decided to settle 3 disputes each out of WTO. Does this show there's more trust between the two sides? And if that really is the case, are we looking forward then at the possibility of India getting its GSP status back?
So I think you have to understand those were irritants, and both sides agreed to withdraw them and to focus on the positive part of the relationship. Yes, we have, for example, tariffs on Indian steel coming into the US. Those needs to be addressed. I think GSP is not a showstopper between the relationship. When you look at the goods under GSP categories, they are the fastest rising exports from India to the United States. Yes, it'll be a good, I call the cherry on the cake, if you're able to get GSP, but that is not that critical. And there has been, I would say, there's no big push from either side to restore that, but I think there have been some discussions. So if that comes, it'll be very good.
Dr. Aghi, do you believe that much more needs to be done on trade apart from what we've already seen? US is India's largest trading partner, and trade issues, especially tariffs, have been a niggling factor between the two sides.
Well, when you look at countries such as China, its economic growth was substantially supported by export strategy. And when you look at India, we are trying to basically up the game by driving exports. And if you want a trade between India and US to be $500 billion or $1 trillion, then the export factor has to play. So the question you have to ask is, what are the impediments? Yes, you have issues on tariffs, you have issues on ease of doing business, you have issues on consistent policy making. I think those are the areas we need to focus on because the opportunity and potential as US companies de-risk their presence in China provides this opportunity to India to manufacture more, open the domestic market, but more important is leverage the growing market with the US itself and drive its GDP from 3.75 trillion to 5 trillion or 10 trillion in the short and mid-term.
All right, Dr. Agi, many thanks for speaking to NDTV on that issue. Let's move on now and a quick wrap of some of the international stories that we are tracking. Pakistan has finally reached a deal with the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, to be able to stabilize its failing economy. The preliminary deal of $3 billion is set to be done by mid-July. The already struggling Pakistani economy plunged to an all-time critical low after the flash floods last year that destroyed crops, resulting in food shortages and prices spiraling out of control, leaving millions struggling to put food on their plate. French President Emmanuel Macron held an emergency meeting after violence erupted in France this week over the fatal shooting of a teenager by the police. 17-year-old Nahal M. was shot in the chest by the police in a town on the outskirts of Paris. The killing sparked violent protests that spread across France. Saudi Arabia is investigating a shooting outside the US consulate in Jeddah on Wednesday in which a guard and the assailant were killed. The shooting took place as the final day of the Hajj pilgrimage was underway, raising serious security concerns. US officials confirmed that no American was hurt and the consulate remained secure. Let's move on now. The UNICEF Regional Director Sanjay Vijay was in India on his maiden visit and he spoke to NDTV on the contribution India can make in shaping the future of the youngest lot of the world, that's the children. Many thanks for speaking with NDTV, Sanjay Vijay. First of all, I want to ask you the assessment of the UNICEF specifically on education of children and how it has been impacted in after COVID. So 1 year on, what are we seeing?
So firstly, Maha, thank you very much for having talking to me on this, and I'm really privileged and to be with you. So on your question on learning loss due to COVID is a huge concern for UNICEF. Globally, in any case, the kind of quality of education indicators were low even before COVID. But what COVID has really done is it's set us back substantially, and the indicators are that now it's much worse. And across, on average, across the developing world, about 7 in 10 children who are 10 years old cannot read a simple sentence and gauge the meaning. So it is a real crisis, because a lot of investment is going into education, and yet the outcomes are poor. Now, with regards to India, India has conducted a national assessment, a national assessment to look at how and the nature of the learning loss over that period. And what then that has enabled India to do is to put in place a number of measures, both around the foundational learning, the kind of reading, numeracy, the kind of basic building blocks, but also through the new national education policy to put in place measures to make sure that learning addresses better the kind of outcomes that are needed to succeed in life and in employment. So making sure that the learning is improved in terms of the student and the learner being ready for the world of employment. So the assessment was important.
Okay.
It identified the areas that needed focus, and then there's action is being taken, and we've been privileged to be part of that process.
Sanjay Vijayashekhara, talking about India, this is the year of India's G20 presidency. What are the UNICEF's expectations of taking up the cause of the children, the future of the world at that platform?
Issues that are central for children, young people and women are reflected as a core part of the decisions and declarations and that are part of this G20 summit, and that they are carried forward into subsequent presidencies, and that there is action behind it. So we have worked, and just yesterday I met with the G20 Sherpa, who was very gracious to see us, and again, we put on the table, and I know India's presidency is very keen on putting on the table issues related to health, maternal newborn child health, with particularly around tangible things that can be done, around digital innovations and how India has leveraged that to achieve results for children around immunization and children's health. So making sure that there's very firm decision-making around that, and then subsequent action. But we also have very strong markers, or working with the presidency to put very strong markers around foundational learning, what we were talking about a bit earlier, that every child should be able to read and write and have basic numeracy at the age of 10, as well as around climate action. For that, we also put forward a very clear kind of concepts and proposals for shock responsive social protection. So social protection schemes that support children and their families to respond, to be resilient to the climate shocks that emerge. So what we hope as UNICEF and expect and are working towards together with the Indian presidency is to make sure that there is very clear decision-making and action around children as part of the G20, because the G20 together have a huge influence on the future of the world's children.
Sanjay Vijayashekhara, many thanks for speaking with NDTV. Let's move on now, and finally let's talk about the changes that we have seen over the past few years in the India-UK relationship as well. Now, leader of Labour Party has outlined his approach towards India. Keir Starmer has said there's an opportunity, and this is rather the Indian century, really. Labour leader's opening address was at the India Global Forum, and it underlined the shifting approach towards India. Listen in.
When the history of two great nations is intertwined, as ours is, that can cast a long shadow. But look, I don't see that shadow over today's India. I see a modern nation, a confident nation, a nation that knows that while there are profound challenges in the world at the moment, this is, without question, a time when the stability of nations is under threat, that the opportunity is there for this to be an Indian century, with India shining as the world's biggest democracy, a huge contributor to global growth and prosperity. Now, the challenge, as I see it now, is for Britain to step out of the shadows in its mind, to cast aside the entitlement of history, and deepen our relationship with the real India, the modern India, the future India. And yes, look, we can celebrate our shared culture. We know as well as anyone that Indian food is the greatest in the world. And if the rest of the world continues to ignore the arcane wonder of cricket, we can laugh together at their misfortune.
Well, that's it then on India Global this week. See you again next Friday. We're taking a quick break now, but before that, a quick reminder to check out NDTV app for the latest news. And if you haven't already, download the app now.